Greg was so angry that he lost his Christmas cheer. The problem was that he was an expert on the subject. He knew the answer to that question, but he didn't want to get into a discussion. He just wanted to lay back until dessert was served just before lights out. The dishes had been cleared from the large oval table a few minutes before. They were in a private room in the back of the upscale restaurant. The waiters left the coffee service on a sideboard and gave the room to the guests until they called for dessert. Greg panicked when the conversation suddenly veered in that direction. He was ruthlessly steered in that direction by the incessant clatter of axes and the slight tinkling of the coffee pot. Greg's wife, Kiara, quickly stamped her heel into his foot. Barely holding back a grimace, Greg added as much meekness to his voice as he could and said, "No, please. I'm in enough trouble for being a nerd." The last thing anyone needs is a biologist ranting about a topic that has more to do with ethics than biology. Everyone sitting at the table was a PhD. Greg was the only PhD with a science background. He was a biologist who specialized in reproduction. All of his recent work had been on the reproduction of Homo sapiens. The other 23 were in the Department of Foreign Languages. They were all experts in literature, philology, and linguistics of various living and dead languages. This lunch was a Christmas party for the language faculty disguised as a solstice celebration. Greg decided it was a clever manipulation to hint that addressing him with such a lecture would tire people out and make him feel uncomfortable. He hoped so, as he shifted his gaze to his wife, who was blinking her eyes approvingly in appreciation of his cleverness. Unfortunately, his gambit didn't work. Radu, acting as the main hatchet man, was unstoppable. "Come on, Greg. I think everyone here is genuinely interested in hearing the answer," Radu said. "If you want to know the answer, raise your hands." About 3/4 of the table immediately raised their hands. When they saw that the vote was hopeless, the remaining quarter slowly raised their hands so as not to look suspiciously dissenting from the conventional wisdom. Greg marveled at how tangible social pressure made people almost immediately and subconsciously compromise their values. Greg silently noted that the three people who least wanted the discussion to go in that direction were Kylie, Elodie, and Ciara. Greg considered them the three amigos. Kylie was the wife of Radu, the instigator. Elodie was the wife of the department head, Emil. Kiara was Greg's wife, and she was the reason he was at the dinner in the first place. That these three were against it came as no surprise. In October, Elodie and Kylie traveled to a conference in Vancouver to present a paper together. On the day of their return, Elodie and Kylie showed up unexpectedly at Greg's house. Kylie had shoved him into the shed in the backyard, and the women spent most of the day in the master bedroom. It was impossible not to notice that Elodie had spent that entire day sobbing hysterically, in an emotional breakdown, while Kylie and Ciara desperately tried to bring her to her senses. Greg was completely excluded from this discussion, but he heard Ciara advise Elodie to come clean, and later heard Kylie say that what happens in Vancouver stays in Vancouver. It wasn't hard to guess what was going on. At the time, Greg was contemplating whether he should tell Elodie's husband, Emil. If it had been about a friend, Greg would have told him right away. In this case, the problem was that Greg and Emil hated each other. Emil had never been friendly to Greg and had always treated him like a servant. The animosity had turned into an active feud during the faculty ball the previous spring. Kiana had sent Greg to the bar to get fresh drinks. When he returned to the table, Kiana wasn't there. He found her on the dance floor with Emil. Emil's hands were everywhere, on her chest, on Kiara's back. Kiara looked embarrassed but didn't protest. Greg waited until the couple moved to the dance floor next to the Chancellor. Then he stepped in and deliberately set up a scene with the Chancellor as a spectator. This caused Emil to publicly apologize to him and leave the dance floor in shame. Greg expected Kiara to be furious at his action, but instead she was embarrassed and humbled, which made Greg wonder if she was complicit. That evening on the way home, Kiara told him that she had quietly tried to talk Emil into behaving himself, but he wouldn't. Kiara said that she had been afraid of making a scene and was secretly glad that Greg had intervened. For weeks afterward, Kiara called Greg my hero when she said hello to him. After this incident, Emil did not acknowledge Greg's presence or speak a word to him. When Greg found out that Emil's wife had cheated on him, Greg decided not to tell him. Judging by how upset she was, Elodie was undoubtedly remorseful for her act. He left it at that. At the table, after the vote for Greg to answer the question suddenly became unanimous, Greg resigned himself to his fate. Okay then, Radu, state the question briefly, and I'll do my best to answer it. Is cheating by a husband on his wife the same crime as cheating by a wife on her husband? Radu asked with a smirk. Greg smiled. You're posing that question as a yes-no. Let the biological chips fall wherever they want. The answer will be unambiguous, but no one at the table will like it. We'll have to get into technical arguments about why that answer is clear, and then everyone will lose their temper and disagree. It's not worth it. Kiara frowned when Greg used profanity, but it didn't seem to bother anyone in the group. Kiara experienced a burst of inspiration and suddenly spoke. So, new rule. If the conversation turns into an argument, we change the subject. Anyone disagree? Kiara was well respected in her department and had a sharp mind. There was silence at the table. Everyone agreed with her proposal. Kiara looked into Kylie's eyes. Greg saw Kylie give Kiara a slight nod. Kiara turned to Greg, and he began. Biologically, a man cheating on a woman is not an equal crime, nor is a woman cheating on a man. They are different acts with different causes, execution, consequences, and outcomes. This answer stunned those present. Gerhardt, a bearded professor from Bremen, quickly asked, if they are not the same thing, which one is worse? In his thick accent, the letter W was pronounced like a V. A pin drop was heard around the table. Everyone wanted to know the answer. Even Greg's wife Kiara looked at Greg expectantly. Biologically speaking, it's much worse for a woman to cheat on a man than the other way around, Greg said. Kylie, following his lead, groaned loudly. Come on, that's just male patriarchal hyperbolized nonsense. Women have been oppressed by men throughout human history, and they're much more vulnerable when their mates decide to leave them. The table descended into pandemonium and chaos, and Greg leaned back in his chair and breathed a sigh of relief. Greg looked into Kiara's eyes, who smiled back and then looked into Kylie's eyes. Kylie had to whistle with 2 fingers for the arguing and discussion to subside. Everyone agreed that if an argument started, we would agree to disagree, Kylie said. It's time for a new topic. I'd really like to hear what Charan has to say about the conference she just returned from in Beijing. In the sudden silence, everyone looked around the table, but Charan wasn't there. Charan's husband, Chen, said, Excuse me, she just went out to the ladies' room. She'll be back in a few minutes. In the silence that ensued, Elodie's voice, a slightly accented soprano, suddenly said, Why did it get worse? I'd like to know. There was something both compelling and emotionally vulnerable about her request for information. She sounded as if she desperately needed an answer. That got everyone's attention. Greg muttered quietly to himself. This was exactly what he was trying to avoid. Kiara immediately started rubbing my leg like she was treating a 70s Formula One car. Look, this is a contentious discussion, and it's about to go off the rails, Greg said. Please don't make me ruin the Christmas party. Solstice Festival, Dorothea predictably exclaimed. When Dorothea was born in Maryland, her parents named her Dorothea. She met and married her husband Pietro while studying Italian literature in Turin. After marrying him, she began calling herself Dorothea and took his last name. This was good for her career as a scholar of Italian literature. Greg took the silence as agreement and breathed a sigh of relief that his run through the minefield was over. Unfortunately, a local resident, Radu, an axe sharpener, spoke up. Aren't you an expert in this area, Greg? After all, this is the subject on which you wrote your latest research papers, isn't it? Yes, Radu, you're right, Greg replied. Similar issues are on my resume. However, my experience won't make it any less controversial. I want to hear your considered opinion, Greg, Radu said, with a flash of victory on his face. The man was an epic agitator. Everyone at the table looked at Greg again. Greg looked at Kiara in a desperate attempt to get her to bail him out. Kiara only shrugged her shoulders. Well, shit, here we go, Greg said internally to himself. Here's the argument, he began. As a species, Homo sapiens evolved to exhibit sexual dimorphism. There are members of different sexes, and each has certain and distinct abilities. This imposes different roles on them with respect to reproduction and child-rearing. Ethically and morally, members of both sexes are fully equivalent in value. A human life is a human life when subjective criteria such as value are taken into account. Do you understand me? Greg saw the people around the table nod. Everything he was saying made sense to them. Ethics and morality have nothing to do with biology. Biologically speaking, if you look at the hard facts of reproduction, ovaries, ova, testicles, sperm, uterus, placenta, mammary glands, male and female sex are not equivalent. They complement each other. What about transgenderism? Dorothea asked. Transgender is not a biological term. In biology, you can be either male, female, or intersex. Intersex has a precise biological definition where gender cannot be classified, either because of mismatched genital anatomy and chromosomes or a birth defect that makes their sexual anatomy completely ambiguous. The intersex condition occurs in only 0.018% of the population. That's about 50 to 60,000 people out of the 32 million people in the United States. No, Greg said this in a way to encourage everyone to argue about transgender issues. Personally, he was sympathetic to people with gender identity issues. He suspected that most of the people here today did as well. He hoped the table would pick up that axe and descend back into chaos. Greg cast a meaningful glance at Kylie, hoping she'd catch his cue, but she was so busy casting death glances at her husband Radu that she missed her chance. Surprisingly, the explosion Greg had prayed for never came. At that moment, Chiron returned to the table, intrigued by the silence and tension. What did I miss? Chen pushed her away and began to whisper to her. Is everyone with me so far? Greg asked, practically begging someone to object. No one objected. There are two arguments for that. Unequal exposure and gender complementarianism. The unequal impact argument is that if you look at all of human history, about 85% of women who reached maturity reproduced. Less than 40% of all men who reached maturity reproduced. In some eras, the figure was less than 20%. Women are much more likely to reproduce than men. At this point, Gerhard interjected into the conversation to ask, what is the scientific basis for such a claim? Have you all heard of the Human Genome Project, which is run by Francis Collins? Greg asked. They mapped the entire human genome back in the 90s. About a third of the guests nodded. I heard about it on NPR, Fatima said. She was glad to finally be part of the conversation. The Human Genome Project has spawned a new discipline known as computational biology. Biologists study changes in DNA over time by conducting gene sequencing of human remains from different historical periods. They use computers to analyze genetic changes and modifications over time. And based on these calculations, they were able to determine that there were twice as many women breeding as men? Gerhard asked. Exactly, said Greg. It's complicated factual math. Nods echoed across the table. Greg praised himself that it was the right decision. He knew they weren't going to argue about the validity of math with a nerd like him. The results are staggering, Greg continued. Somewhere around 8,000 years ago, the genetic diversity of males suddenly declined. The ratio of breeding females to breeding males was 17-1. Looking at it another way, it turns out that every male who procreated had 17 wives. This suggests that mankind was massively polygynous. Why? Kiara asked. Greg chuckled to himself that his wife, who had tried to cut off this conversation a few minutes ago, was now genuinely curious. There are a few anthropological hypotheses, but they have no factual scientific basis, Greg replied. So what are they, Greg? Kiara asked. The basic hypothesis is that large-scale stable agricultural societies emerged around this time. This allowed for the accumulation of wealth and power, which necessitated the creation of an army to protect the accumulated wealth. This led to the specialization of labor and the creation of professional soldiers. It led to the creation of empires through large-scale wars of conquest. You had concentrated wealth, large numbers of young men who were taken to war under the command of a small number of professional military men. The best surviving young men tended to be the strongest and most capable, and they were usually recruited into the ranks of the professional military. After a few such cycles, you had two types of men, super alphas and confirmed betas. The super alphas reproduced, and the betas either didn't get wives or didn't survive long enough to conceive. Greg replied. But that's what anthropologists say. A biologist like me can't take it seriously. It's an unscientific hypothesis. It's not testable. To Greg's disappointment, only two heads nodded in response to this statement. How would a reproduction ratio of 1 to 17 affect society? Kiara asked. Kiara asked. The fittest males reproduced more often. As a result, the gene pool was more adaptable, but with less genetic variation. This was favorable for the alphas, terrible for the females, and downright disastrous for the betas. How is it bad for females? Kylie asked. Don't they get better genes for their children? If the ratio of males to females in a breeding is 1 to 17, then females distribute their share of their mate's time and attention at a rate of 1/17 of what they would normally receive. And that's assuming the mate is fair. However, knowing how humans are structured, we can say that the male has favorites, and they get almost all of his attention. The rest of us get the leftovers. Imagine you are one of 17 wives. You will spend less than 20 nights a year with your spouse, and your children will barely know their father. The women at the table didn't like that. Besides, the value of a single wife is essentially nullified. The wife will know he has 16 others like her. She will have no leverage to get her husband to cooperate in any way. Besides, can you imagine how the wives will fight politically among themselves to get her husband's time and attention? Greg flinched sharply, and all the men laughed. Even some of the women smiled. But it's not like that now, Kiara remarked. True, Greg replied, smiling admiringly at his wife. Human civilizations have developed social systems against hypergenia. Legal systems protecting individual rights evolved. As a consequence of individual rights, women gained the legal right to own property and self-determination. Monogamy, as a coercive social institution, developed. How did legal systems prevent hypergyny? Chen asked. I'm not an anthropologist or sociologist, Chen, said Greg. To get a full understanding of the situation, you'd have to go to someone with that knowledge. I suspect an anthropologist would say that the development of legal systems and individual rights put an end to the principle of force makes right. The strongest man could no longer just take what he wanted. Yeah? And what makes monogamy so good? Radu asked with a smirk, as if it went without saying that monogamy was bad. Monogamy is the best possible deal for all men and all women, Greg stated. Individuals, those who marry shitty partners, may not like it, but for society as a whole, it's the best possible deal. It allows a higher percentage of men to procreate, maximizes the genetic diversity of the species, and maximizes the support a wife gets from her husband in raising children. Wait a minute, Chen said. We haven't answered the original question. Why does the fact that men reproduce less than women mean that a woman cheating on a man is worse? Greg was grateful to Chen for his intervention. From the beginning, women outnumber men. Men are in the minority. They also have far less chance to reproduce than women. They are at a severe disadvantage compared to women. Any infidelity hurts both parties, but since the man is already disadvantaged, the consequences are by definition worse for him. So the consequences are unequal, Greg said. The room became so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Gerhardt suddenly burst into a deep laugh. Ho, 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 ho. Greg is very cunning, isn't he? Talk to him at your own risk. Gerhardt's mirth raised the mood at the table, and soon many others were also laughing and congratulating Greg on his arguments. Several glasses were raised. When the laughter subsided, Gerhardt asked, You said there is a second argument, an argument from gender complementarianism? This topic is much nerdier. Have I lost the hall yet? Greg asked, hoping people would be bored. For some reason, everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. He figured this was where he would make his point. It is a biological fact that males and females have different reproductive organs. This means that males and females have completely different roles in reproduction. This has sent males and females down different evolutionary paths in terms of reproductive strategy. Males are biologically necessary only for sperm production, and they evolved as promiscuous reproducers. When mating, males have evolved to be opportunists rather than choosy. Males breed throughout the social hierarchy. The technical term for across and down is hypogamy. That's another way of saying anything that moves. This elicited laughter around the table. Men have that reputation, don't they? Charan asked. Her statement was met with many nods. Men are pigs, declared Dorothea. Dorothea declared. Greg watched as most of the women at the table rolled their eyes at Dorothea's remark. On the other hand, women are biologically necessary for egg production, pregnancy, and carrying newborns. They pay a very heavy price for carrying and raising children. This statement was immediately embraced by women. They realized that part of what Greg was talking about was true. Women have to cope with the consequences of reproduction, so they are very picky about choosing offspring. That's why women choose very carefully who they mate with. They look for someone in a partner who can ease the burden of raising children. Women have evolved in such a way that they almost always mate with those who are above or higher in the social hierarchy. They don't like to mate with anyone less desirable than themselves. They are not opportunists, but strategic breeders. There is a biological term for this: hypergamy. So how do male hypogamy and female hypergamy manifest themselves? Greg asked rhetorically. Here's a hypothesis. Abe is a rag picker. He has a very beautiful daughter named Barb. Barb marries Craig, the average-looking son of a wealthy merchant, rather than Danny, the rowdy son of one of the rag pickers. Craig chooses Barb as his partner over Ellie, the ugly daughter of another wealthy merchant. That's how hypogamy and hypergamy manifest themselves. I don't understand, Dorothea said. In our hypothetical scenario, Barb favors the average-looking Craig, who is on the same social level, over the more attractive Daniel, who is on the same social level, Greg said. Social status turned out to be more important than, say, looks. Barb prefers a partner higher in the hierarchy. It's hypergamy. Do you understand? Dorothea nodded. Greg continued. For Craig, beautiful Barb is a more attractive mating partner, being on a lower social rung, than ugly Ellie, being on the same rung. For Craig, looks were more important than social status. That's what hypogamy is all about. But it's not that simple. Women aren't always driven by money, Dorothea said. I use the word status rather than money, but I agree with your point, Dorothea. Men aren't always driven by beauty alone either. My example was deliberately simplistic to illustrate the principle, agreed Greg. Women are guided by a number of factors. They're not just looking for wealth. They look at physical beauty, social standing, intelligence, wealth, and masculine traits, such as ambition and strength. All of these are combined into a comprehensive measure we call status. The status of different men establishes a hierarchy. Women choose the one who best matches their status. This time there were many nods around the table. On the other hand, men have a different idea of status. A woman's intelligence, personality, and wealth are taken into account. But looks carry so much weight that other factors aren't as important, Greg said. Does anyone disagree with that? He asked. No one did. Having identified gender differences between hypogamy and hypergamy, my colleagues and I are asking the million-dollar question. Why did these different natures arise? Anyone care to hypothesize? Greg looked around the table. No one had the courage to speak up. And here's what the dominant view in our field of study thinks. Childbearing and parenting is difficult and expensive. Women need support in the form of resources, partnership, and protection. As a result, the practice of pair bonding between males and females has emerged. When males pair up, they provide their mates with resources, partnership, and protection. All of these are necessary for parenting and provide the most stable environment to do so. What attracts females is a heuristic indicator of the male's ability to provide all of these things. Status is a composite measure of these heuristics. Any objections? Greg addressed the group. Once again, no one voiced an opinion. What do females give to males? Greg asked. Everyone had an opinion, but no one wanted to voice it. Sex? Radu asked. The women at the table frowned. The death stare Kylie was giving Radu made everyone at the table uncomfortable. Greg decided to be conciliatory. Radu is not wrong in the general sense. Sex is a concrete manifestation of an abstract political goal for men. The abstract political goal for men is to obtain genetic inheritance. What men get through pair bonding with women is children. A man needs a woman to give him children. This was well received because it gave women power they didn't have before. Everyone laughed and joked that it was very obvious, but no one noticed it. Everyone laughed and it eased the tension a little. Greg summarized. When males and females pair up, it represents a compromise between the two sexes to get what they want. The female gets support in raising the child, protection, resources, and cooperation. The male gets exclusive access to the female for reproductive purposes. In this way, he can maximize the opportunity for genetic inheritance. It is crucial to note that pair bonds in Homo sapiens are not mandatory. In some animal species, pair bonding is so rigidly programmed that they cannot become aroused except with a bonded partner. Humans, on the other hand, do not need pair bonds at all. This is why courtship and pair bonding rituals are so complex. Historically, most cultures did not depend on the couple to create a couple at all. The modern notion that we have the right to choose our partner and that he or she should be chosen for love is very recent. Objectively, it was not a very successful experiment. Greg paused to see if there would be any objections. There were none. Couple bonds, which are not obligatory for human beings, are caught up in culture. That makes the subject of study anthropology and sociology, not biology. Biologists can only look at parts of it that are universal to all cultures. Pair bonds are themselves universal. There is not a single culture on Earth that does not have the concept of marriage as the foundation of the family unit. One of the few universal rules of pair bonding is that males get exclusive access to the female. Exclusive access is of great importance. In pair bonding, the biologically worst-case scenario for a male is that his paired female will allow an unpaired male to impregnate her. In other words, the male in the pairing squanders the support he gives the female to support the genetic inheritance of the other male. What about polyandry? Fatima asked. I heard an NPR interview about a group in Tibet that practices polyandry. Polyandry is the proverbial exception that proves the rule, says Greg. There were cultures that supported polyandry. For the most part, they have abandoned the practice. The people of the Tibetan Plateau and the indigenous peoples of the Marquesas Islands still practice it in limited numbers. Polyandry is generally thought to be a temporary response to specific local conditions. In both Tibet and the Marquesas Islands, there was not enough arable land to feed the population. In Tibet, there wasn't enough arable land to share to support two brothers and their families, so the brothers ended up sharing one wife. If they did otherwise, the younger brother was sent away and received no inheritance. The situation was similar in the Marquesas Islands. The main difference was that the husbands who shared women were friends rather than brothers. There was considerable absenteeism in both cultures. One husband would go traveling for a year, and the other would stay with his wife. The next year, they would switch places. In both cases, culturally, it was a temporary condition. If the stress caused by the shortage of arable land is removed, this practice will come to naught. In Tibet, there is no longer a shortage of food, and the practice is now in severe decline. In the Marquesas Islands, the practice has all but disappeared after a smallpox epidemic wiped out 75% of the population. Greg asked, "Is everyone watching me?" He expected to be criticized, but there was silence around the table. Greg saw that several people at the table wanted to ask about adoption or foster children, but no one dared to ask. Greg's lack of courage was fine with him. "What's the worst-case scenario for a woman?" Greg asked. Several people had an opinion, but no one wanted to voice it. Dorothea exclaimed, "When does a man cheat on his woman?" "What does adultery mean?" Greg asked. "Cohabitation outside of the pair bond?" "Yes," replied Dorothea. "What biological harm is done to a woman when a man copulates with another woman?" Greg asked. "He has broken his promise of fidelity," replied Dorothea. "The promise of fidelity is part of the marriage contract. The marriage covenant is a social structure with a theological, not a biological rationale," replied Greg. "Can we leave theology aside for the purposes of this discussion?" Greg laughed inwardly at taking that step. No one wanted to touch the third branch, religion. Treason is such a heavy term. How about instead we say, Violation of the terms of the marital relationship? Greg asked. He got mostly nods, and Gerhardt's face showed a look of understanding. He was a little faster than the others. Okay, said Greg. Hypothetical, World War II, Andy's from Kansas. He left his wife Betty and kids at home and went off to war. He became a navigator in the Air Corps and was sent to England. He was a member of a bomber crew. One day, Andy got a leave of absence and went to London. In London, he met a beautiful young Englishwoman named Colleen. There was an instant connection between them. He invited her to dinner. They got drunk, and their evening ended with a sexual liaison. The next day, Andy returned to his unit and never saw Colleen again. After the war, Andy returned home to his wife and they raised their young family together. Here's a question. Did Andy violate the terms of the pair bond biologically? Of course, Dorothea replied. Gerhardt, however, understood. No, he didn't. Nan. Greg was greatly relieved that it wasn't him who had thrown the bomb. Everyone seated at the table turned to Gerhardt, who smiled. Biologically, a woman is supported by a pair bond to raise a child. The worst-case scenario for Betty would have been if Andy had withdrawn support from Betty and given it to Colleen. Andy clearly did not do this. Thus, from a biological standpoint, Andy has fulfilled the terms of his pair bond. The women at the table hesitated for a moment, trying to think of an answer. But he broke his promise, Dorothea said. That's forbidden theology, Chiron gently reminded him. Greg decided to take a chance. If you think this viewpoint is nonsense, consider how married men understand fidelity. The same man who shamelessly flirts with a woman at the office and tries to get her into bed gets furious when his wife dances and flirts with a man at a wedding reception. Why is this happening? Is this man a hypocrite? Is he crazy? Greg left room for an answer. No one answered. Smiling, Greg concluded, or does he have millions of years of evolutionary wisdom embedded in him that says cheating for a man is different than cheating for a woman? The group pondered this for a moment. Greg realized he was being a bit sly in this argument, but no one tried to change his mind. Greg moved on to the next step. Now consider an alternative scenario. Our man Andy went to London on vacation and met Colleen. They fell in love with each other, but being religious, Andy and Colleen refused to copulate. However, for the next 9 months, Andy gave his paycheck to Colleen instead of sending it home to Betty. Betty returned home struggling to feed the children and keep the clothes on their backs. From a religious moral standpoint, Andy was perfectly faithful, but from a biological standpoint, was he faithful? Gerhardt smiled. Of course not. At this time, the men couldn't come up with a counter-argument. Then Gerhardt shocked Greg by asking about the reverse scenario. What if, Gerhardt reasoned, while Andy is in England, Betty has an affair with Steve, the foreman at the aircraft factory where she works? Has she violated the terms of her steamy union? What would you say? Greg asked Gerhardt. I would say yes, replied Gerhardt. She broke the pair bond. The women all strongly disagreed. If he can get away with having an extramarital affair, so can she. Kylie growled. Greg wasn't surprised that this argument was coming from her. Not only did what happened to Kylie in Vancouver stay in Vancouver, what happened to her in Atlanta stayed in Atlanta. What happened in Chicago stayed there. What happened in London stayed there. That's why Greg wouldn't let Sierra attend conferences with Kylie. Unfortunately, Emil didn't know any better when it came to his wife, Elodie, and sent her to Vancouver, unaware of the circus atmosphere Kylie had surrounded herself with. The consequence of this was Elodie's downfall. Greg didn't blame Kylie for her intemperance as much as he could have. Kylie's husband, Radu, had been doing it with at least one of his graduate students every year for the past 10 years. This was well known to the faculty at the university. Radu got away with it because he held a high position and his academic reputation was impeccable. One day, Greg calculated how much Radu spent at the university hotel in a year entertaining his mistress. The amount was large enough to make him wonder if Radu was due a volume discount. The only thing Greg blamed Kylie for was dragging Elodie into his squabbles. Ah, you're talking about fairness, Kylie. What is justice? Greg asked and shrugged. It's a topic for philosophers, criminal justice departments, or maybe even theology. There's no such thing as fairness in biology. Kylie wanted to respond, but couldn't think of what to say. Greg, I want to hear more about your assumption that Betty was unfaithful when Andy wasn't. It was more or less the same scenario. Greg was very surprised to hear his own wife ask such a question. Everyone sitting at the table turned their heads at once to look at Kiara. They wanted to know if she and Greg were going to disagree and quarrel. But seeing only open curiosity on Kiara's face, they were disappointed. Gerhardt stepped in and answered the question. The answer is clear, Kiara. Betty has waived Andy's right to genetic exclusivity. And what if she doesn't get pregnant? Kiara asked. His genetic heritage was not jeopardized. Greg noted proudly that it was an excellent question. His admiration for his wife swept over him again. Gerhardt looked at Greg. Whether she gets pregnant or not is irrelevant, Greg replied. Kiara frowned. Why not? She asked. Greg replied, Betty knew better than anyone on Earth that pregnancy was a possibility. Birth control is probabilistic at best. We are talking about percentages, not absolute birth control. There are only two known 100% effective forms of birth control: total sterilization and the word no. This caused Gerhardt, Chiron, and Chen to laugh. Everyone else was horrified. As soon as Betty allowed Steve to enter her, Greg continued, she violated the terms of her couple's union. A condom, if used correctly, is 96% effective. In 4 out of 100 cases where Betty allowed Steve to penetrate her, the condom would have failed and a pregnancy would have occurred. If she had somehow managed to use birth control effectively to avoid the natural consequences of sex, the risk still remained. She deliberately jeopardized Andy's exclusive right to genetic inheritance. Greg admired himself as he said this. So far, he had been brilliant. At this point, he was making such an effective argument that no one dared to contradict him. Now all that remained was to successfully move on to the last topic. Emile held it out to him, shouting across the table, This is, as you say, utter crap. Emile suddenly said in his heavy French accent. It was the first time he had spoken to Greg all evening. Emile was an impressive figure. He was ridiculously good-looking, a chin chiseled from granite, neatly styled hair the color of salt and pepper, false nails. He had played tennis professionally in his youth and retained a trim and athletic physique. He also possessed the refined manners and smug superiority of the French aristocracy. Emile was also very tall, 193 centimeters. Greg's wife Kiara once told him, as if the metric system meant something to the daughter of a machinist from Pensacola, Florida. Emile's figure became especially impressive when he was angry. He'd been furious from the moment they sat down to dinner, because Greg had pushed Sierra out of the seat Emile had reserved for her next to him and sat her next to him at the far end of the table. So how was it? Asked Greg to Emile. To say that a man is unfaithful because of the way he spends his money, not because of where he puts his stick, is absurd. Absurd. Emile exclaimed. The whole table shuddered, not so much from his words as from his rage. There was anger and hatred in his tone. Heads bobbed back and forth, looking at Emile and Greg, trying to figure out what was going on between them. Oh? Greg replied. Hypothetical. A married man buys a $100,000 sedan to impress the married women he's trying to seduce. At the same time, this man's wife doesn't have a working car and struggles to drive the kids to school every day. You wouldn't consider that infidelity even if he doesn't provide her with the funds and joint support she needs to raise her children? Greg knew that Emile had bought a Mercedes S-Class last year because Kiara had rhapsodically described it after being invited to drive it for the first time. Greg also knew that his wife secretly drove to Elodie's house every morning, drove her and Elodie's children to school, and then drove Elodie and herself to work. This added almost 40 minutes to Kiara's morning commute to work. She did it to support her friend, just as Kylie drove Elodie and her children home every day. Emile was perturbed for a moment by Greg's hypothesis. He realized that Greg was talking about him. At that moment, Kiara began trying to physically drill a hole in the top of Greg's foot with her heel, but Greg was determined. He shoved Kiara's foot away from him with such force that Kiara cried out, "Ow! Greg, what the hell?" Greg leaned forward and looked contemptuously at Emile. You don't consider it infidelity when a married man spends nearly $2,000 a month taking women who aren't his wife to fine French dinners at Le Coucou, do you? As soon as Greg said this, Several women at the table put their hands to their mouths and began to blush. Greg looked first at Kiara, who instantly turned beet red. She couldn't look him in the eye. Then he looked around the table. Most of the women Emil had brought into the restaurant were both embarrassed and shocked that they weren't the only ones. Emil's fury doubled when it became clear to everyone that Greg was talking about him. You don't think a married man spending almost $20,000 on a tennis bracelet for a married woman he's trying to seduce is infidelity, do you? With those words, Greg pulled a jewelry box out of his pocket. In it lay the Tiffany tennis bracelet that Emil had given Kiara earlier that week. He opened the lid and lifted the bracelet to show it to everyone at the table. Applause erupted all around. Next to Emil, tears were streaming down Elodie's cheeks. Greg tossed the box containing the bracelet from Tiffany across the table so that it fell to the floor in front of Elodie. "Elodie, that bracelet should belong to you, not Kiara," Greg said angrily. Greg looked at Kiara, who looked like she was about to get physically sick. She covered her mouth with her hand. Tears were running down her cheeks as well. Greg knew that Kiara had thought to hide the bracelet where no one would ever find it. She hadn't thought about how excited her husband would be when the private investigator showed him the tape of Emil handing the bracelet to Kiara during their secret weekly gourmet French lunch. Greg looked at Elodie, who was furious. She started hitting Emil and yelling at him in French. It had been 15 years since Greg had last learned French in school, but he could hear Elodie saying over and over to her husband in French, "She's my best friend." Emil pushed Elodie away from him with anger, stood up and pounced on Greg. That was easier said than done. He was at the opposite end of the huge oval table. He had to stomp around the outer perimeter. "Emil, sit down," Greg shouted. "You don't want to do that." Greg experienced a momentary flash of fear as the fight or flight reflex kicked in. Emil was probably 6 inches taller and weighed at least 40 pounds. Greg was quite sturdy, however, and as Emil approached, he calmed down. Emil came within arm's length of Greg and stopped. Quick as a snake, Emil's right arm extended to strike Greg in the face. Emil was far more athletic than Greg gave him credit for. His muscles contracted quickly, and his reflexes were excellent. One of the women shrieked in horror. Such screams are unproductive, Greg noted to himself. Greg stepped back slightly, turned his shoulder, and Emil's fist was half an inch from his nose. Greg didn't see it, but he felt the second half of the combined blow. He instinctively ducked his head. Emil's left hand flew right over Greg's head, catching his hair. It was very close and nearly a disaster for Greg, but he stood his ground. Greg took a step forward. He raised his arm and locked it just above Emil's elbow. Using the weight of his body and Emil's momentum, he immediately moved Emil into a direct grip. Greg didn't give in to the temptation to break Emil's elbow in half right in front of everyone. Instead, he applied a little pressure, and it made Emil whimper. Emil desperately tried to free himself from the hold. Greg slowly increased the pressure until Emil stopped resisting and stood perfectly still. "Let me go," Emil shouted. "That hurts. You're going to break my arm." "Shut up, Emil," said Greg. "You attacked me. Did everyone see him come at me and take a swing?" Greg asked. "Yes, Greg," replied Chen. "We all saw it." "I don't want any more violence, Emil," Greg stated. "If you keep fighting and it comes to violence, I will literally break your arm in half. I'm smaller than you in stature, but what you don't know is that I'm the youngest and smallest of 5 brothers. Growing up, they beat the crap out of me on a daily basis. As a result, I became very tough and could put up one hell of a fight. My brothers and I went to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu together for many years. I earned my black belt before I even got my doctorate. I earned my black belt, Emil." Greg looked around the table. Everyone was watching with rapt attention. Kiara had a strange look on her face. It was a disbelieving awe. She couldn't believe that her husband had surpassed Emil in physical combat. She reconsidered everything carefully. Greg suddenly released the pressure on Emil's elbow and kicked him in the back of the knee. Emil collapsed to his knees with a crash. Greg then brought Emil's arm behind his head and locked it in a headlock. Emil couldn't move an inch to avoid breaking his wrist. Turning to the entire table, Greg said, "If you haven't realized what's happened yet, we just found out that Emil is taking all of our wives to secret romantic dinners at Le Cuckoo. Emil, could you please tell these women that the lunches are arranged so that you can have some romantic one-on-one time alone? When Emil didn't answer, Greg pressed harder on his wrist. Emil hummed and said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to tell them." Ladies, if Emil hasn't taken you to Le Cuckoo for a romantic tete-a-tete in private, please raise your hand. Be honest. I've been watching Emil for quite some time now, and I know who has succeeded and who hasn't. Don't make me call you a liar. Only Charan and Gita raised their hands. Greg looked at his wife to see if she had the courage to lie. She didn't. Her hand was down. She wasn't looking at him. Greg laughed in bewilderment. Other than Kiara, Charan and Gita were the most beautiful women in the room. In fact, Greg thought Charan was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen in real life. She was regularly mistaken for Lin Chiling, a famous model and actress. Gita was adopted by a large family from Madison, Wisconsin. She played many sports and attended Duke University on a cross-country scholarship. She was a distance runner with exotic looks and a cultural upbringing typical of the American Midwest. Greg found her extremely attractive. Well, Emil, why didn't you ask Charan or Gita? Are you racist towards Asians? Greg asked. Emil didn't answer and Greg crossed his bones on his wrists. Emil hummed and said, "They're both still new to the department. It'll be a little while before we can make the right contact." Chen, Charan, Gita, and Gita's husband Raj opened their mouths in shock. "Gentlemen," Greg said, "it must be a shock to you to learn that your wives have been agreeing to and submitting to the romantic advances, dinners, and lunches of the head of the department. I'm sorry to bring you bad news." The name of the restaurant, Le Cuckoo, was part of Emil's subtle message. Le Cuckoo is French for the cuckoo bird. For those with little or no knowledge of biology, I will tell you that many species of the family Cucullidae are notorious for engaging in brood parasitizing. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds and force others to pay the cost of raising their offspring. Hence the word cuckold. Greg received several nods from the men at the table. Make no mistake, gentlemen, the women know that Emil intended to sleep with them. I've seen tapes of several of his dates. He tells his wives bluntly, like a cheeky man, that his goal is to convince them to cheat on you with him. To do this, he uses every means at his disposal. Emil is defaming us in front of our wives. As your boss, he knows where you stand career-wise. He lets his wife know how much you disappoint her and how inadequate you are. I am the only husband of a wife who doesn't work in a department. He can't use my career to denigrate me, so instead he plays on my physical inferiority when he tries to seduce my wife. Isn't that ridiculous? When he tried to fight me, I kicked his ass in 5 seconds. I beat him up and he never laid a finger on me. Greg made an effort to smile and meet the eyes of everyone at the table. Emil brags about his wealth to our wives, pointing out that he regularly takes them to the most expensive restaurant within a 100-mile radius. He talks about his wealthy upbringing and brags about how much money he has. What most wives don't know is that he's actually broke. The investments, the yacht and niece he likes to mention, and the fortune supposedly left to him by his parents are all fiction. He took out a second mortgage on his house to buy that Mercedes he drives our wives around in. Both cars are close to being impounded. Tell them where you got the money from, Emil. Emil answered nothing, and Greg squeezed Emil's fingers again. The money came from Elodie's parents, he hummed. She had an inheritance and a trust. She asked me to take care of them. Emil flaunts his intellect in front of our wives, touting his work and bragging about being quoted in academia. He is a fake academic. His claim to fame is his critique of Eliana Greimer-Tayeb. At the time, this work was considered so fresh and groundbreaking that it was published in hardcover, and it is the one cited by almost all of his colleagues. Guess what? He didn't write it. He bought it from the woman who actually wrote it, a classmate who had a heroin problem. He paid her money for years to keep it a secret. Greg tugged Emil's wrist lightly. Tell us her name, the woman who wrote your dissertation. Marie Cellier Anouilh, he said, writhing in pain. We went to school together. We dated before she had this habit. Sighs broke out around the table. Emil also flaunts his position in society so that your wife knows that he is her boss, that he is an aristocrat, and that he has an important and extensive network of friends and connections that make him an extraordinarily powerful being. This is all nonsense. He was never an aristocrat. He was the son of a man who owned a tobacco shop in Grigny, France. Tell everyone, Emile, how your father lost his tobacco shop. Go on. Greg twisted Emile's wrist again and said, he sold it to get me on a tour. What kind of tour? Greg asked. The tennis tour, Emile said with obvious irritation. The only legitimate claim he makes is that he was a tennis pro. He briefly played on the tour in the late 80s, Greg said. I was able to talk to his former coach. He said he was good enough to be on the tour, but never good enough to win anything. Basically, he was only known for his looks. He was the male version of Anna Kournikova. What was your highest score at any tournament on tour? 24th, he said. 24th place, Greg corrected. So, gentlemen, to land the plane and tie it to my little biology class, this piece of shit used hypogamy and hypergamy for deceptive purposes to attack our wives. He artificially portrayed himself as a higher status male, scoping out mating opportunities further down the hierarchy. All of them, to one degree or another, have bought into it. I know all the women here. They are neither stupid nor foolish, yet Emile was exceptionally good at it. All men, to one degree or another, is a pretty high bar. He's one of the best con men we've ever encountered. Unfortunately, in the end, he's just a charlatan. Greg looked around the table. The faces expressed varying degrees of anger, disgust, and humiliation. Elodie, Greg continued, I offer you my deepest apologies for having to find out what he did to you in this way. I didn't want to do it publicly, but I had to. I have something for you. It's a Christmas present that I ask you to accept. Greg pulled a box out of his jacket. He held it out to Chiron. Can you give this to her? The box passed from Elodie's hands. Elodie asked, should I open it? Yes, Greg replied. No. She opened it and there was a remote key fob for the Honda. She sat, stunned. My older brother owns a Honda dealership, and he owes me some huge favors. He paid them off by giving me a Honda Odyssey minivan. It's used and a few years old, but it's in great shape. It's fully paid for, tax, title, and registration included. The only thing I have not been able to do is add it to your insurance. Hopefully, that will save you from having to ask to give your kids a ride to school. It's currently parked in the parking lot outside the house. Elodie started crying and sobbing. Kiara and Kylie instantly stood up and rushed over to comfort her. I will also say this, Elodie. If you are uncomfortable staying in your current home, you can bring your children to live in my house. Your children will have to share bedrooms with ours, but you can take the guest bedroom and we'll work it out. The house is in my name, so you can stay as long as you want, even if things don't work out with Kiara and me. At those words, Kiara burst into tears. Kylie and Elodie suddenly began to comfort her. Greg never ceased to be amazed at how insanely strong their friendship was. Even after Kiara's betrayal with the bracelet and the secret dinners, Elodie had her back. Emile, are you listening? Greg asked. Yes, replied Emile dismissively. This is where you leave us, said Greg. When I let you go, you must get up, walk out the door, and leave this room. If you don't, I will beat the shit out of you in front of 22 witnesses who despise you and are willing to confirm that you struck me first. Understand? Yes, Emile replied, with his usual contempt. Yes to what? Greg asked. Yes, sir, replied Emile. I laughed. I was going to say yes, Greg, but sir will suffice. Greg let him go without warning and took 3 steps back to give himself room to maneuver. Emile stood up, removed the handcuffs, and walked out the door. He closed it behind him. He didn't look back. Taking a deep breath, Greg sat down at the table. All eyes were still on him. Greg took a sip from the water glass that stood at his seat. His throat felt dry. His hand shook as he drank. Greg said, I'll tell you something you may not know. This private university has a relatively small faculty. Everyone in the other faculties watches what goes on in the foreign language department and knows that something is rotten in Denmark, figuratively speaking. Emile is the only department chair in the college that no one has ever heard of and who only hires married couples in his department. In fact, my wife is the only faculty member who has been hired in the foreign language department without simultaneously hiring a spouse. This was because I was personally hunted by the chancellor himself as a potential chair of the biology department. Emile hired Ciara because the chancellor gave him a direct order to do so. Emil has always told everyone that his unusual hiring practices are designed to promote faculty stability and employee retention. But other faculty members doubt that this is true. Faculty members are uncomfortable with the fact that his methods allow him complete control over both husband and wife. The other faculty members don't like this. I can tell you that the professors in the biology department have started calling the foreign language department a harem. How you decide to collectively handle this crisis will determine the reaction of the rest of the faculty. If you band together as a group and go in circles, you will probably manage to emerge from the disaster without becoming a laughingstock. My advice to the ladies who have been victimized by this charlatan is to go to human resources together and file a group sexual harassment complaint. Get this asshole fired, then work like hell to restore the department's reputation. He picked up the glass of water on Kiara's desk and sipped from it. I have evidence that Emil slept with several wives. I was wondering if I should report it to her husbands tonight, but decided I didn't want to humiliate them. They obviously didn't understand what their wives were doing. I firmly believe that what happened is a husband and wife only affair. It is nobody else's business. I propose that we collectively decide that no woman will ever make a public statement about whether or not she did or did not have sex with Emil. Ladies, this means that if you are innocent, you are bound by holy honor to keep your innocence to yourself. Say nothing, so that your guilty coworkers won't be humiliated and can retain a modicum of dignity. Does anyone disagree? There was silence in the room. Greg said, "Then from now on, let's never discuss who did or didn't sleep with Emil." There was complete silence in the room. Greg decided to broach the last topic. "I will leave the room in a few minutes and let you two discuss among yourselves what to do. Before I leave, however, I want to broach the subject of forgiveness. Despite all the nonsense I said earlier about breaking pairing agreements, there are no ethics or morals in biology. More often than not, the strongest creatures just take what they want. It's horrible and disgusting, but it's the only law in nature. A young male lion takes over a pride by killing or chasing away the previous male. Once he does this, he kills the cubs or drives them away so that all the offspring are his. There is nothing right or wrong about this, he's just doing what he wants to do. If that requires destroying a bunch of cubs, so be it. Brood parasites leave their eggs in the nests of other species. If the nesting pair doesn't discover the egg being laid, their brood is doomed. The parasite's egg will hatch before their own. The first thing the newly hatched parasite will do is immediately destroy other eggs or kill all the chicks in the nest. There is nothing right or wrong about this. The brood parasites get away with it, so that's what they do. Obligate predators don't feel guilty about the other species they eat. Cannibalism is common throughout the animal kingdom, especially cannibalism of young. There are species that intentionally destroy habitat to keep out competition. There are even plant species that intentionally destroy their habitat to keep out competition. There's nothing right or wrong about it. It's just what they do. That's the harsh reality. Humans are different from animals in that they have a very strong idea of right and wrong built into our consciousness. The term sapiens from Homo sapiens comes from a term meaning wisdom. The wisdom we possess is to separate right from wrong. Along with the rules of right and wrong, we humans have developed many related technologies: apologies, forgiveness, and restitution. These are the things that distinguish us from animals. We've already discussed the ratio of male to female reproduction, 1 to 17. If we had lived 8,000 years ago, that's how tonight would have gone. Emil was your alpha. It was his harem. I say it was his harem because all the women here, except for Gita and Charan, submitted to his authority, allowing him to have affairs with them behind her husband's back. Kylie started to object, but Greg held up his hand and said, "Let me finish. I think I've earned the right to finish my speech. I promise it will only last a couple minutes." Greg looked at those seated at the table until they nodded or looked away. Like I said, this was Emil's harem. He was the alpha. I defeated him in physical combat before your eyes. What would that have meant 8,000 years ago? Well, the first thing I would have done would have been to castrate Emil. Then I would have pulled out his teeth. Then I would have removed all of his fingers except his index fingers and thumbs, leaving only those so he wouldn't be a completely useless slave. Then I would sodomize him in front of everyone. I would do this to demonstrate that I was superior to your previous alpha. This would let you know that a new order had arrived. Next, I would announce that all wives are mine. The first man who objected, I would slit his throat in front of the others. Then I would ask if there were any more objections. The strong men would be castrated at once. Those who were weak and sucked up to me immediately, I would leave untouched and instruct them to watch the castrated ones later. Then, I would take one of the wives in front of everyone, probably the one that put up the most resistance. I would make it clear that resistance was futile. All the slaves would be placed in slave quarters. The men would labor day after day growing crops for me. Women would be placed in my harem and start at the bottom of the status hierarchy. The wives I already had would beat you, starve you, and treat you like shit. I would put you in the rotation and you would all get your turn with me. You learned quickly that status women are the ones who bear me children. If you bear me children, you'll be pampered, given privileges, and brought into my bed more often. You see, that's the main indicator of status in the harem. Those who give me the most pleasure get more time with me. You used any means to ensure that I successfully planted my seed in your bellies. Once you became pregnant, my entire attitude towards you changed. I showered you with compliments and affection. I spent hours snuggled up to you with my hands on your belly and whispered how sexy you were carrying my baby. And when our baby came into the world, I cradled him to me, showing you how fatherly tender I was to your offspring. You would quickly realize that I am a good man who loves his children. You would have fallen in love with me at first sight. If you had my children, you would likely live your life as happy women. Eventually, you would begin to praise me for my strength, justifying that I protected you, provided you with a good standard of living, and made your offspring more prosperous and wealthy. Likewise, you will begin to despise the weakness of your previous husband. You will do all of this without even realizing how you are being manipulated. Greg leaned back in his chair and stretched. He looked into the eyes of each woman at the table. He was shocked to see that some of the women were quite aroused by his story. Why did people 8,000 years ago do things like this? They did it because in that time and place, people really believed in the concept of might makes right. Greg spread his arms out to the sides, pointing across the room. So if it's might makes right today, it's now my harem. Greg noted that he could hear a pin drop. Greg looked each woman in the eyes. Going around the table, he said, "Men, your wives belong to me. All I have to do is decide which woman I will take tonight in front of the audience." There was a distinct excitement in the air. It startled everyone present. Greg couldn't believe they were just sitting there watching this. He had never thought before that such intelligent people could be so sheepish. He thought to himself that this was a very strange moment. He broke the silence. Aren't you glad we don't believe that anymore? As we said, human morality and social systems have evolved. We now believe in individual rights. We believe in a woman's right to self-determination. We believe in the sanctity of marriage. We don't believe in mutilation and castration as punishment. We no longer believe in the right to own people. The greatest force that has influenced the evolution of our moral systems over the last 2,000 years has been Christianity. This may come as a shock to everyone here, but I know Christianity really well. I was raised in the church as a child, and despite being a strict evolutionist in my adult life, I still understand what the church teaches. I marvel at this. For those of you who lack my knowledge and foundation, the main characteristic of Christianity is forgiveness. Christ preached that we can be forgiven for our sins against God. A prerequisite to receiving forgiveness for our sins is a willingness to forgive others who have sinned against us. This is stated in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. The whole concept of receiving forgiveness and forgiving others is embedded in it. It is perhaps the most important technique embedded in Christianity. Gentlemen, I know you are angry because somehow or other our wives have harmed us by engaging in a secret affair with that scoundrel Emile. I ask you to seriously consider forgiving your wife. Emile was charming, deceitful, persuasive. He had power over them. He fooled them all. Christmas is the feast of the Incarnation. We celebrate the fact that Christ became flesh and dwelt among us. He came to earth to bring us forgiveness. Although I am personally very angry with Kiara, in the spirit of the upcoming holiday, I will try to be gentle. I will do my best to find a way to forgive her so we can reconcile. I hope you men will also embrace the spirit of the season. If you don't and would rather be hard-headed, you will say that you prefer to live in a world where everyone can be right. And I will remind you that in this world, your wife now belongs to me. Greg stood up, walked to the door and opened it. One of the waiters was waiting for him there. Are you ready? He asked. Yes, sir, the older waitress replied. Greg stepped aside and the waitress brought in a cart filled with desserts. A second cart brought in several magnums of champagne chilled in ice buckets. Greg addressed the group again. As a gift to the group, and as an apology for ruining your Christmas party, I took the liberty of purchasing several magnums of Veuve Clicquot champagne for the group. Greg watched the women blush and cast leering glances at each other. Gentlemen, you don't know this, but every time Emile brought our wives to Le Coucou to enjoy a gourmet meal, he asked the waiters to bring an unopened bottle of Veuve Clicquot in an ice bucket. Emile would tell the women that if they decided to spend the day making love to him, he would pop the cork to celebrate. That was extremely strong manipulation, wasn't it, ladies? Several of the women blushed. None of them responded. To honor Emile's departure from your lives and ours with dignity, I bought some Veuve Clicquot for the group. With a pop, the first magnum opened. The flutes were quickly filled and handed out. Several shocked faces looked into their champagne glasses. Greg raised his own flute and waited for everyone else to do the same. To husbands and wives, Greg said. The group repeated, to husbands and wives. When everyone started drinking, Greg said, they are all members of my harem. He sipped from his flute and said, I leave it to you to discuss what to do with Emile. Merry Christmas. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Greg sat in the car for quite some time before he saw the coat-wrapped members of the foreign language faculty get out. They got into their cars in pairs and drove off. Some were talking excitedly. Some were arguing. Some kept a sepulchral silence. At least one couple, Greg no longer hoped to recover from this evening, were hugging, and both were crying. Elodie came out at the end with Kiara. Kiara saw Greg and made a gesture to him that he realized meant, wait a few minutes. Using the key fob, Elodie found the Odyssey that Greg had bought for her. Kiara walked over to the van and Elodie cried as she accepted it. Kiara helped her into the car and adjusted the seats and mirrors. Greg could see her demonstrating the controls. They had the same model of van, so Kiara could help Elodie with everything. Kiara then sat in the passenger seat next to Elodie, and they talked for a while. I knew they had a lot to discuss. After about 20 minutes, Kiara got out of Elodie's van and walked over to our car. As she got into the passenger seat, tears came to her eyes. Greg, she said, I'm so sorry, Greg held out his hand and said, stop, gently but firmly. She stopped immediately. Greg said, I want to speak first and you guys just listen, okay? Kiara nodded. I went to a counselor to deal with my anger and figure out if we should reconcile. She helped me a lot. The fact that I didn't kill that jerk in that room, or at least brutally insult him, is an absolute miracle. Do you realize that? Kiara nodded. My counselor convinced me that I had to, for the sake of our children, for your sake, and for my own sake, find a way to get past this and stay together. She helped me develop a plan of action. That plan is based on radical honesty. My psychologist says that people who are caught cheating often begin to deny, tell incomplete truths, minimize, rationalize, and outright lie. They use all these forms of deception because the stakes are so high that they have a perverse incentive to lie. Cheaters do this in the hope that they will be able to mitigate their partner's initial shock. They think this will give them enough maneuvering room to save their marriage. They believe that lying to save the relationship is justified. They reassure themselves that they will make it up to their spouse later. She says the impulse to do so is a misguided kindness. In fact, lying is the worst thing a cheater can do because the foundations of trust have already been destroyed. Deception on the part of the cheater shows the hurt party that their partner simply cannot be trusted anymore. Did you realize that my counselor was trying to explain why radical honesty is important? Yes, Greg, Kiara said. I can test you on your honesty. I can demand an explanation from you without telling you anything I know. Then I can use your ignorance of what evidence I have against you to induce you to deceive. Denial, partial truth, minimization, rationalization, or outright lying. I have good reason to do so. If you told me exactly what I already know, it would help me relax because it would show that you are serious about justifying yourself and that you really want us to move on with our lives. However, if you act in a deceitful manner, I will conclude that you cannot be trusted. Do you understand me? Greg waited for Kiara to nod again. She nodded. I was going to do exactly that, but my counselor convinced me it was a bad idea. Any false information on your behalf would be the very proof of betrayal I seek. It would virtually guarantee a negative outcome. So let me say right off the bat that I know a lot more than you think I do. Then there was something wrong in the way you and Emil interacted the night of the ball. My brother recommended an investigator to me. He's been following you ever since. In fact, he was doing a job for money out of professional courtesy to my brother. I have transcripts of all the conversations you had with Emil at Le Cuckoo. And videotapes too. I also have all the messages you exchanged and all the letters he sent to any of your personal accounts. Even the secret Me View Elves Loca account that you think I don't know about. I think I know everything there is to know, Greg said. Greg thought it would make her nervous, but actually Kiara looked relieved. Then you know I never had sex with him, she replied. Thank God, I was so worried I wouldn't be able to convince you. I know you didn't have sex. I also know that Emil, who has been seducing you for over a year, patronized you completely. Greg replied. You loved being the object of his attention, and you invited him to try again and again. You had secrets from me. You had secrets even from Elodie, your best friend. You weren't honest with me about where you were on the days you had secret dinners with him. Worst of all, you accepted the gift of a bracelet. Sorry. He pursued me because you could never wear it around me. The only reason I could accept it is if you weren't going to be around me for long, Greg replied. No, Sierra said. I'm never going to leave you. Never. Tears ran down Sierra's cheeks. So you were going to hide it forever and only wear it when you managed to sneak away for another secret date with him? He asked. She started to speak, but Greg stopped her. We'll discuss everything that happened and why, Kiara. You'll have a chance to justify yourself. Like I said, I have a plan of action. The fact that I'm a scientist means this will be both good and bad for you. The good thing is that I'll act with an open mind and let the chips fall where they may. I will let my observations, not anger and resentment, determine what happens next. If you are open and honest, we have a chance to overcome this. The bad thing is that I will demand proof. I can't be changed by mere feelings. I trusted you for years because I was sure you loved me and had the right priorities. Now, I'm no longer sure you love me, and I'm morally certain you don't have clear priorities. If you had them, you would never have accepted the bracelet. For this reason, there can no longer be an old memory in our relationship. Trust is the true foundation of the marital relationship, not love. My trust is broken. Kiara nodded, wiping her nose with a napkin. She understood and accepted it. As I said, we will discuss it. Perhaps we will discuss it to the death. However, I'm only going to ask you one question today. Are you willing to go through the long and painful process of rebuilding our relationship? In other words, are you willing to pay a heavy price to stay married to me? Greg had imagined asking Kiara that question dozens of times. Each time he imagined himself cold and unemotional as he asked that question. He never imagined asking it on emotion and nearly losing his feelings. Unfortunately, that was exactly what had happened. Kiara was suddenly completely on top of Greg. Her embrace was neither passionate nor tender. It was desperate. I love you, Greg. I love you more than life itself. I won't let you go. I know I messed it up. It was my fault, and I'll do whatever it takes to recover. You name it, and I'll do it. You're going to have to scrape me off of you. Pulling himself together, Greg put the car in gear and accelerated. They drove together, moving forward. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.